They said bull elephants never look back, that once they left the herd, they walked alone, guided only by instinct and memory, detached from the cries of calves and the pull of mates. They said a bull's role ended at birth. No ties, no emotion, no return. But they had never seen him. He had roamed far, wandered for seasons at a time, but he always returned to the same watering hole, the same grove, the same gentle giant of a female who never questioned why he came back. She never needed to. Their bond wasn't written in dominance or tradition. It was written in the way he stood just close enough, in the way she leaned toward him when the sun fell, and most of all, in the calf they had brought into the world together. A playful, wide-eyed boy with too much curiosity and not enough fear. That morning the air had changed. The sky was thick with a heat that didn't belong, and birds flew in tight, silent formations as if something was coming they couldn't stop. The herd moved quickly, too quickly. Mothers huddled their young close. Trumpets echoed warnings through the trees, and his mate, she did what she always did. She stood between danger and their son. The crack came like lightning, not in the sky, but in the earth itself. A jagged tear, sudden and sharp, swallowed part of the trail they had been walking. She stepped just wrong. Her leg gave, and the weight of her body drove her down onto a fallen branch she never saw coming. The sound it made when it snapped beneath her was louder than the thunder overhead. She didn't scream. She never screamed. But the calf did. His cries shattered the air, raw, high-pitched, full of a terror that even the most hardened bull would feel in his bones. The others ran. Survival took over. It always did. Herds move. Herds flee. That's how they live. But he didn't move. He turned. The moment was small, just a shift in weight, a slow pivot of massive shoulders. But in that motion, every rule cracked, the same way the earth had. Because bulls don't come back. They don't stand over fallen mates. They don't nuzzle their calves and wait. But he did. He pressed his forehead gently to hers as she lay still, breathing, but just barely. Dust swirled around them like ghosts. And then he stepped between their son and the rest of the world. And in that moment, something ancient shifted. Not in the earth, but in the story nature thought it had already written. He didn't move for hours. The storm passed. The herd vanished into the trees, not from cruelty, but instinct. Yet he stood, massive and unmoving, his body casting a shadow over the calf who still trembled, and the mate who still breathed but didn't rise. His ears flicked to every sound. His trunk swept the dust away from her face again and again, as if she might open her eyes if the world looked a little clearer. The calf tried to nuzzle under her belly the way he always had, but there was no shelter left there. So instead, he leaned against his father's front leg, small and shaking, and for the first time the bull lowered his head and wrapped his trunk around his son, not to guide him, not to move him, but to hold him. The ground grew cold as the sun dipped, and insects began to chirp in the stillness. The grove that had once been full of rustling leaves and familiar footsteps was now silent, and still he stood. When night fell, a lion passed through, eyes glowing, breath low. Its body moved like water across the land. It saw them, smelled weakness. But the bull didn't flinch. His eyes met the lion's, silent, steady, and full of something older than fear. The predator didn't come closer. No one expected the bull to stay through the night. No one expected him to move his mate's head gently to the side when she coughed. No one expected him to guide his calf to her again and again, whispering reassurance in gestures that only elephants know. But he did. By morning, his feet were buried slightly in the earth beneath him, pressed down by weight, not just of his body, but of choice. He could have left. He was supposed to. He didn't. Instead, when the first humans arrived, rangers drawn by the cracks in the land and the stories of separated herds, they didn't see a wounded elephant lying alone. They saw a family, a child, a guardian, a monument of flesh and bone and will that had decided something was worth staying for. The humans moved slowly, gently. They didn't try to scare him off. They didn't have to. He didn't fight them. When they laid thick pads under her broken side, he moved just enough to give them space. When they poured water over her skin, he didn't charge. When they finally lifted her onto a rolling stretcher and her trunk lifted weakly toward the calf, he was already there, walking beside them, step for step. Some said it wasn't possible, that male elephants don't have this in them, that it must have been a fluke or instinct twisted by trauma. But those who saw it knew better. This wasn't reaction. This was decision. He stayed through the surgeries, through the long days when she didn't wake. He stood outside the rescue center just beyond the fences, sometimes circling the perimeter, sometimes still for hours. And the calf, he never left the father's side. When she opened her eyes again, weeks later, she saw both of them waiting. No one knew what it had cost him, the hunger, the thirst, the silence. But some things are never measured in scars. They're measured in who waits. And he did. Through storms that soaked the shelter's fields, through days when food was scarce and the sky held no color. He waited not just near the fence, but beside it, each day his massive shadow arriving with the sun and lingering past dusk. Rangers started to leave water for him. Others began to talk of him with reverence, as if he were something between a soldier and a ghost. But to the calf inside those gates, he was simply father. Not because he taught him how to forage or trumpet or flap his ears, but because he never left. The calf changed. Slowly, then all at once. His steps grew stronger, his eyes more certain. He would rush to the fence line when he heard the low rumble of his father approaching, brushing his trunk between the posts, as if reaching for what had never actually been taken. Sometimes they would stand there for hours, heads touching through the gap, saying nothing, doing nothing, just being. Inside the center, the mother healed, but not in straight lines. Some days she refused food. Others she called out in the night, her trumpet full of confusion and pain. But every time the calf pressed his head against her flank, she would settle. Not because the pain had gone, but because he was there, and because somewhere, deep inside the noise of her body and the ache of her memory, she knew she hadn't been left behind either. Weeks became months. The Rangers began talking about release. Plans were drawn, gates prepared. They would be moved as a unit, they said, calf and mother. But when someone asked about the bull, the room fell silent. He wasn't tagged. He wasn't part of the rescue system. He hadn't been brought in. He had chosen to stay. That night, a worker stepped outside to watch the sky. She found him standing beneath the stars, silent as always. She didn't approach, just stood. And after a while, he shifted his weight, turned his head just slightly toward her, and let out the softest breath. The next morning, before the sun rose, they opened the gates. The mother walked out first, slower than before but upright. Behind her, the calf bounced forward, unsure of his steps but certain of his direction. And then, there he was, the bull, waiting at the edge of the trees, as he always had. When they reached him, he didn't move quickly. He didn't trumpet or charge. He simply lowered his head again and touched hers. Then the calf, one by one, as if counting the pieces of something he'd almost lost. They walked off together, not quickly, not dramatically, just together. And no one said anything. Not the Rangers, not the researchers. Because some reunions don't need celebration, only quiet, only breath, only the steady sound of three elephants moving as one. And in that rhythm, soft, deliberate, unshakable, they became more than just a family. They became a story passed from ranger to ranger, from whisper to wind, until even the trees seemed to part when they walked. No one marked their path, no GPS, no collar, no drone. But somehow, sightings trickled in from every edge of the preserve. A bull, a female, a calf, always together, always moving with purpose, never urgency. They weren't running anymore. They were teaching. Villagers would wake at dawn to find prints near their fields. Deep, rounded, spaced just so. Mother, child, guardian. And in the hush before sunrise, elders would sometimes say, "They've come again." Not with fear, not even surprise, but awe. As if seeing them was like glimpsing something holy that shouldn't belong to this world anymore. And still, he stayed. Years passed and the calf grew. Taller, bolder. His tusks came in uneven at first, awkward like youth, but his stride grew sure. His mother taught him how to forage, his father taught him how to watch. But it wasn't in instruction, it was in presence, in how the bull walked slightly behind them, always watching the rear, always listening, not controlling, just staying. And the calf learned not just how to survive, but how to stay. There came a season when drought hit hard, pools dried, the earth cracked again, and herds scattered like leaves. But those three, they didn't split. They moved slower, conserved energy, leaned into each other. And on the worst day, when the sun scorched the plains and the air buzzed with heat, a baby elephant from another fractured herd collapsed from dehydration, abandoned, alone. The young bull, the calf grown now, approached her. No one moved at first, not the mother, not the old bull, just silence, thick with heat and memory. But then, like some unspoken signal, the old bull stepped forward, the same way he had all those years ago when the world cracked and choice arrived in the dust. He nudged the baby gently with his trunk. Then again, he stood over her, shielded her, and the younger bull watched and understood. They didn't leave her behind. Later, rangers spotted 5 sets of tracks heading into the deeper forest. The old bull, the mother, the grown son, the little one who now followed closely. And someone new, a shadow that lingered but never led. A legacy, maybe, a beginning again. Because family, it turns out, isn't made only of blood. Sometimes it's made of who turned back, who stayed, who waited, and who taught someone else to do the same. Because legacy isn't carved in stone or written in the air. It's passed through footsteps, one beside another, one choosing to turn back, one choosing to wait. And sometimes when that choice repeats enough times, it becomes more than habit. It becomes culture, a silent language of love handed down not in words, but in actions no one expects from creatures built to survive. The old bull moved slower now, his tusks dulled with age, his back curved just slightly from the weight of years lived and remembered. But still, he led, not from the front, but from the rear. The way only those who've lost know how to lead. By watching everything, by noticing the smallest cry, by never forgetting what abandonment looks like in the eyes of the young. The younger bull, now nearly fully grown, began to walk wider circles around the herd. He scouted. He waited for stragglers. He paused at unfamiliar sounds. And the mother, steady as ever, carried the rhythm of them all. It was as if each of them had become a part of something greater than instinct, a movement, a message. And the calf they had once taken in, the orphan left behind in a cracked land, she thrived. Her ears grew long and expressive. She trumpeted loudest at dusk. She always walked beside the old bull, even as he slowed, matching her pace to his. And when she lay down to rest, her trunk always curled toward his, as if tethering herself to the one who chose her when no one else had. Time, as it always does, carried them forward. But they didn't vanish. They became story. Story in the footprints pressed deeper into dry earth than any wind could erase. Story in the rangers' journals, each noting how they moved with symmetry no textbook could explain. Story in the quiet gasp of villagers who saw 5 shadows crossing a moonlit ridge and whispered, "They're still here." And perhaps most of all, story in the way other elephants began to linger at fallen members. Not all, not always, but sometimes. Long enough for someone to notice. Long enough for a calf to be seen. Long enough for someone else to learn that walking away isn't the only way. That staying, waiting, holding ground, that too is part of survival. That love can be an inheritance, one passed silently but powerfully from a bull who broke every rule. To a son who watched, to a daughter who believed, to a future not yet written, but forever changed. Because some stories are not told through sound, but through the echo of choices that ripple long after the moment has passed. Somewhere in the vast quiet of the land, trees grow where they once stood, their roots curling gently around the memory of stillness. Water returns to places where they waited, flowing slow and steady, as if paying tribute to those who stayed behind when everyone else ran. And in the eyes of other elephants, those who never saw them but walked paths they once carved, there is something different. A pause at the edge of a clearing, a hesitation before turning away from the weak, a second glance at the fallen. Not instinct, not training, but memory. The kind that doesn't belong to just one, but to a species learning, quietly, powerfully, that love is not a weakness, but a survival strategy of the soul. The old bull's steps grow heavier. His pace slows with the years, and sometimes he lingers at the edge of a meadow while the others move ahead. But always one turns back. Sometimes the young bull, sometimes the calf they rescued, sometimes even a stranger, one they once met only in passing. And when they do, the old bull looks at them, not with surprise, but with understanding. Because that's the gift he gave. Not protection, not leadership, but the imprint of what it means to belong and what it means to be responsible for someone who cannot keep up. And so their story continues, not in headlines or documentaries, but in the space between footsteps, in the stillness of a calf choosing not to run, in the gentle nudge of a trunk at dawn, in the quiet stand of a bull who remembers a moment long ago when he too had a choice. It becomes myth, then memory, then instinct, until someday no one remembers where it began. Only that once, in the dry winds of a broken season, someone stayed, and because of that, everything changed. Not with thunder, not with any sudden shift, but with the quiet rewiring of what was once assumed unchangeable. Where once strength meant distance, now it meant presence. Where survival once meant moving on, now it meant staying behind, just long enough to carry someone with you. Because love, when shown by giants, does not roar. It hums through generations. And those three, the old bull, the healing mother, and the calf who once looked like loss, became something more than just survivors of a tragedy. They became architects of a new kind of memory, a memory that echoed in places they'd never touched, in the nervous flick of a young elephant's ear when he hesitated before leaving the injured behind, in the careful positioning of bodies during a crossing, always shielding the smallest, in the long, low rumbles passed through the ground like coded promises. We don't leave our own. Rangers started noticing changes. Orphans were being approached faster. Calves were being accepted more readily. Lone bulls lingered longer near family groups. Something unseen, unspoken, was shifting. And though no one could point to a study or cite a data point, the field notes told the story anyway. They were watching. They were learning. And sometimes at dusk, someone would swear they saw them, those three, crossing the far plain, still together, still one body, one breath, one rhythm, a silhouette against the setting sun that didn't need names to be understood, just presence, and the unmistakable feeling that this, right here, was where everything had begun again. Because staying had become legacy, and legacy had become instinct. And instinct, when built on love, doesn't just change the ones who feel it, it changes everything it touches, slowly, gently, permanently. Not just in the land they crossed or the water they drank from, but in the unseen places, the space between a decision and an instinct, the silence that comes just before one heart chooses to stay near another. Their story, once just a moment of loss and love beneath a broken sky, had rooted itself into something far greater than any single herd or species. It had become a kind of truth, one that didn't shout or demand, but lingered like morning mist, soft, quiet, impossible to ignore. Some rangers began calling them the echo line, not because they were loud, but because wherever they went, something stayed behind. A pause, a hesitation, a question in the hearts of those who watched. What if I stayed too? And maybe that's how real change begins, not in the breaking of rules, but in the soft rewriting of them. One step at a time, one calf at a time, one moment of refusal to walk away when staying costs more, but gives more. The old bull's image, carved from years of dust and dusk, became legend. Children in nearby villages learned his outline before they learned their alphabet. Elders spoke of him not with facts, but with reverence. And the mother, they called her the shield, for her body that blocked winds, for her eyes that never turned away, for the way she taught without ever needing a word. And the calf, the one who had once cried out for a fallen body on a cracked plane, was now a leader of his own small circle. He walked differently, waited longer, and whenever a choice came, he turned. Always. Even when it didn't make sense. Especially then. Because that's what legacy does. It doesn't demand to be remembered. It just quietly changes everything it touches, until remembering becomes impossible not to do. Until even strangers, far away, who never saw that family, begin to feel the pulse of something ancient and true. A reminder that staying matters, that love leaves tracks too. And sometimes those are the ones that last longest. Not because they are loud, not because they are celebrated, but because they carry weight. The kind that sinks into the earth with every step. The kind that lives in the silence between words. These are the stories that are not written with ink, but with presence. The kind of presence that doesn't ask to be seen, only to be felt. The kind that remains long after footprints fade, long after the season has turned, long after even the names have been forgotten. In the wild, stories like these are not passed down in song or stone. They are remembered in pauses, in the way a young elephant suddenly chooses to wait for another, in the way a herd reconfigures itself not for speed, but for care, in the way a calf, barely grown, circles back when it hears a cry too soft for others to notice. These aren't lessons taught, they are lessons inherited, quietly, completely. It was no longer about just 3 elephants. It was about every herd that came after. Every calf that dared to believe it was worthy of being chosen. Every bull that hesitated at the edge of duty and love, and then turned back. The story had traveled farther than the land they walked. It had seeped into the wind, carried in the rhythm of rain, etched into the bark of trees they passed without touching. It had become legend, not because it asked to be, but because it refused to disappear. Even the humans, those who once observed from a distance, had changed. They lingered longer in the fields now. Their voices lowered, their cameras clicked less and watched more. Some stopped tracking herds entirely and started protecting the trails they left behind. Not because they were told to, but because something had shifted. And shift, once real, spreads. Not like fire, but like root, steady, quiet, unstoppable. The old bull, now rarely seen, had become myth. But sometimes, just sometimes, on foggy mornings, when the trees barely held their shape, a ranger would see 5 shadows moving across a ridge. One large, one steady, one wild with youth, one born from silence, one unknown. And they'd freeze, not from fear, but from reverence. Because in that moment, the world remembered something older than memory. Something true, something unbreakable, something that asked nothing, but stayed anyway. And in those seconds, the air would feel thicker, the wind gentler, as if even the earth knew it was passing through a sacred space, as if the space between the elephants wasn't distance, but a vow, one kept without promise, one held without question, and all around them, the land would remain still, listening, remembering. Because some stories don't live in history books or scientific journals, they live in the way we pause, in the breath we take before making a decision, in the moments we choose to stay when it would be easier to leave. This wasn't just about elephants anymore. It was about all of us, about what we carry and what we choose to pass on. Because legacy isn't just what's behind us, it's what we leave in others. And that old bull, his mate, and their calf didn't just survive. They changed what it meant to belong. The land where they once walked now held their memory like sacred ground. Rangers built paths around their trail, not over it. Visitors were told stories in hushed tones, not for drama, but for reverence. A wooden carving stood near the ridge where they were last seen. Just silhouettes, no names, just curves of their trunks and ears, etched into cedar, facing east where the sun rose, where everything began again. Children came and asked why they weren't named. Because names fade, the guides would say, but the feeling doesn't. And in that answer, something shifted, a recognition that the greatest stories don't beg to be remembered. They simply are, living, breathing truths that settle in our bones before our minds even recognize them. Some say they still walk, quietly at the edge of what's known, moving through mist, past fallen trees, over ancient roots, not seeking anything, just continuing, as if they know their journey isn't done, as if they carry more than just memory now, but momentum, a pull forward, a promise kept. And when the wind moves through the grass in just the right way, when dusk falls gentle and the world leans quiet, you can almost hear it. Not a trumpet, not a call, but a rhythm of three hearts, still beating, still believing, still together. Because when love writes its name into the earth, it doesn't fade, it deepens. And when that love is shown not in moments of ease, but in trials of pain, it becomes more than emotion. It becomes truth, unbreakable, unspoken, undeniable. Because some truths don't ask for validation. They simply stand, like an old bull turning back, like a mother shielding her calf with her final strength, like a young elephant learning that staying close is stronger than running fast. These aren't dramatic moments. They're quiet revolutions, soft rebellions against a world that often rewards distance more than presence, speed more than stillness, survival more than connection. But this family didn't survive instead of connecting. They survived because of it. In time, what began as a story told between rangers became something shared across continents. Not in headlines, but in classrooms. Not in documentaries, but in bedtime whispers from parents to children. There was once an elephant who stayed, they'd say, and because he stayed, everything changed. And in that whispered sentence, the next generation would lean closer, not to hear better, but to feel more. Because even young hearts understand the language of staying. And the most remarkable part? No one ever taught that bull what to do. No one ever trained him to turn back. There was no script, no instruction, just something ancient, buried beneath instinct and time, that pulled him toward the sound of his calf's cry. That told him, you don't walk away from what is yours to protect. That reminded him, strength isn't proven in isolation, but in the choice to remain. And so he remained. Every storm they weathered, every mile they walked, every night they huddled together beneath a sky too wide to measure. It all added to a single truth. Family is not defined by biology. It's defined by presence, by willingness, by love that doesn't count the cost. Long after they were last seen, people still returned to the place where their tracks had been, not to find them, but to remember how they made them feel. Safe, brave, soft in the places that had long gone hard. And maybe that's what this story was always about. Not a miracle, not even survival, but the courage to change what comes next, gently, relentlessly, together. Because where they walked, others began to follow. Not behind them, but beside the idea they left behind. An idea that said, you are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are worth turning back for. Even when the path is dangerous. Even when it means breaking away from everything expected, everything inherited. Because some bonds aren't about what's easy, they're about what's right. The bull didn't calculate the risk. He didn't weigh the odds. He just knew. Somewhere in the space between the call of his calf and the stillness where his mate had fallen, something ancient rose to the surface. A truth too deep to explain, too powerful to resist. He moved not as a creature following instinct, but as a father choosing presence, as a protector rewriting the rules. And that choice echoed beyond the plains. It reached those who had forgotten what it means to be chosen, who had grown used to being left behind, who had convinced themselves that love must always come with conditions. But here was proof, living and breathing, that it didn't have to, that someone could still turn around, still choose them. Not because they were strong, but because they were vulnerable. Not because they were convenient, but because they mattered. That calf, once trembling and silent beneath his father's belly, grew with that certainty carved into his bones. Not just that he had survived, but why? Because he had been worth the return. And so when he grew, when he saw another young one faltering at the edge of a riverbank or calling out in fear when separated from the herd, he didn't hesitate. He turned too. He stayed too. Because love once shown becomes a guide. It becomes reflex, it becomes legacy, and others followed. Herds moved slower, not because they were weaker, but because they had learned that strength wasn't always about speed. It was about who you're willing to adjust your pace for, who you carry beside you, and who you lift behind you. That's what love left behind when it passed through that family. Not just survival, but a new shape of belonging. And so this story, while quiet, kept moving, in glances and gestures, in the way a young elephant reached its trunk back without looking, already trusting someone would be there. And they were, always, because real love doesn't check the weather. It doesn't ask if the journey will be easy. It doesn't calculate the cost or seek applause. It just shows up, again, and again, and again. Not just when it's needed, but especially when it isn't expected. And that's why it matters. That's why it leaves a mark. Because in a world that tells you to move on, to keep walking, to harden your heart to survive, the one who stays becomes unforgettable. And sometimes all it takes is one. One elephant who turned when he could have disappeared into the horizon. One calf who dared to believe that voice would return. One bond that refused to dissolve, no matter how many storms rose or how many miles fell behind them. Their story wasn't loud. It didn't come with fireworks or fanfare, but it remained, rooted in every step, echoing through every pause, whispered through generations, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a promise of possibility. Because when one chooses to stay, it gives others permission to believe they are worth it, to believe they are not too broken, too lost, too much, to believe that someone, somewhere, might still turn back. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because they want to. And that's the rarest kind of love. The kind that sees you at your weakest and calls you home anyway. That's what the calf learned from his father. That's what the land now remembers in the faint imprint of their feet. Not just movement, but meaning. Not just direction, but devotion. Not just family by blood, but by choice over and over again. Even when it hurts, even when it's hard, especially then. And now every time someone wonders if love can really last, if it can really endure the worst this world has to offer, they look back to that ridge, to that story, to that choice, and they remember someone stayed. And because of that, the world tilted, just slightly toward mercy. It wasn't the kind of shift that made headlines. No one built statues, no songs were written, but something changed in the unseen places, in the quiet corners of memory, in the still moments when the wind rustled through the trees just a little softer, like even nature had learned how to exhale. Because once someone stays, truly stays, that choice ripples far beyond the moment. It becomes a language, a rhythm, a map for those who thought they were lost. That's what the calf carried with him. Not just the presence of his father, but the pattern of what it meant to be held, to be waited for, to be chosen. And when he grew into his own strength, he didn't just become another elephant. He became a keeper of that legacy, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing anyone can do is not move on, is not forget, is not pretend it didn't matter. And so he stayed too, when others stumbled, when the herd splintered, when young ones cried out in fear or old ones began to fall behind. He lingered, he remembered, he reached back, not because it was easy, but because someone had done the same for him. And that's how staying becomes contagious. It moves from one heart to the next, not in grand gestures, but in gentle decisions, small, consistent moments of presence that, over time, build a bridge no storm can wash away. That's the kind of love that writes itself into the landscape, not with noise, but with permanence, with tracks worn into the earth from walking side by side, with the way trees lean just slightly toward where they used to rest, with the kind of silence that speaks volumes, not because it says nothing, but because it holds everything. And in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you might still hear the echo of a father's choice, the whisper of a calf's belief, the rhythm of a bond too strong to be broken. You might hear what they left behind, not just in the ground, but in us, in the way we pause before walking away, in the way our hands linger a moment longer when someone is hurting, in the way our hearts beat a little faster when we see someone fall behind, because something inside us remembers what it felt like to be caught, to be waited for, to be chosen by someone who had every reason to leave and didn't. It becomes a seed, planted not in soil, but in memory. And with enough time, enough presence, enough staying, it grows into something unshakable, into instincts we don't even realize we're following, into the way we look at the people we love and think, I'm not going anywhere, into the way we turn around when we hear someone cry out, even if they're not calling our name. Because staying is not just about loyalty, it's about legacy. It's about who we choose to be when no one else is watching. That's the quiet revolution of love. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't rush to be praised. It simply remains. And the more it remains, the more it rewrites the world. One choice, one breath, one heart at a time. So when we look to the horizon and wonder if anyone will come back for us, if anyone will think we're worth the return, we'll know the answer. Not because someone promised, but because someone already proved it. He stayed, and because he did. We know what love looks like when it's real. We know what it feels like to matter. And that knowing, it changes everything. And in the hush of that evening, long after the dust had settled, long after the herd had moved on, you could still see them, the father, the calf. Not side by side, but together in a way that distance could never undo. They didn't need to speak, didn't need to explain, because the bond between them wasn't built on words or expectation. It was built on choice, on that single, unforgettable act of turning back. And every life they touched after, every young one comforted, every elder carried, every step taken a little slower so someone else could keep up, was a living echo of that moment. It spread, quietly but surely, through the herd, through the land, through us. Because when love stays, it doesn't just survive, it teaches, it transforms, it becomes. Not just a memory, not just a story, but a way forward. If this moved you, then stay. For someone, the way he did.